I'm Barbie Zelizer from the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania, and this is William Roy from the Department of Sociology at UCLA, and we're going to be talking about mediation. Specifically, what do we gain intellectually by thinking about mediation on its own terms? What difference does mediation make? And what different kinds of difference are introduced by different kinds of mediation? What we're going to be doing here is each offering our own view that comes from our own disciplinary perspective, communication and sociology, and focusing on our own research interests, journalism, and music. And then we're going to end with a little bit of a show and tell that we hope is going to promote some conversation. I define mediation as a third-party concept, a conduit or filtering process that distills experience in some kind of organized or strategic fashion, primarily around acts of communication. Mediated communication is contrasted with face-to-face communication, the one being indirect and distant, the other being direct and proximate. And mediation has multiple dimensions: social, economic, technological, political, cultural, all of which work in tandem to distill experience. Why is mediation valuable to think about? Because the more we depend on mediation, the less we realize it's here. We don't normally think that this interchange here is mediated by electricity or by microphones unless they become too obtrusive. And so with journalism, whose mediation mediates reality, that is, our record of things unfolding in real time and space, the record of mediation often comes to substitute for reality itself. That is, we forget that what we get as news is in fact mediated. Mediation is important for thinking about journalism because journalism itself doesn't often admit that it mediates. The rhetoric of journalism, what it says it does, is that it reflects reality. It's a mirror on the real. It's a vehicle of realism. And yet we know that what journalism actually does, not what it says, is mediate all the time. Mediation in journalism takes shape through a range of planes: its institutions, its organizations, its professional lore, its tools of information relay, all of which distill experience on its way to being shaped as news. The implication, of course, is that despite what journalists say and despite what the public often thinks, journalists don't just report the news, they shape it strategically. Both mediation and journalism originate in the shift from pre-modern to modern times, and the British cultural critic Raymond Williams traces this shift back to the 14th century, found in the work of Chaucer, although more generally we tend to locate this shift in the 18th and 19th centuries with the rise of the printing press and the ascent of the newspaper, where mediating becomes central in all the large-scale developments connected with modernization: industrialization, mobility, democracy, at least in its contemporary form, commercialization, even globalization. It's not accidental that journalism gets wrapped up within this turn to modernity, because journalism is seen as a mediating plane in all of these large large modernizing influences. There are three meaning clusters, according to Raymond Williams, with which we think about mediation. The first, I think, will probably be most relevant to many of you here, those of you in psychology, in law, in philosophy, and that is mediation as the act of intermediating, the act of reconciliation, the idea that we reconcile two entities that are distinct from each other. So in psychology, we might reconcile two people or more. In idealist philosophy, we might reconcile God and man. In Marxist theory, we might reconcile labor and capital. This has very little to do with journalism, but the two other meaning clusters that Raymond Williams locates are much more relevant. Mediation is a formal way of expressing what might otherwise remain unexpressed. The ideal of journalism as a mouthpiece for everyone, including the marginalized or disempowered, comes to the fore here. And mediation as an intermediating process or action between otherwise separated parties. These are parties separated not only in time and space, but in vantage point and ideological perspective. And this certainly applies to journalism across the continuum of its different forms: the old notion of the newspaper of record, as well as the more contemporary idea of the internet blog. How does journalism mediate reality? It distills experience selectively, using selective attention, selective exposure, and selective memory through a number of mutually supporting planes. The institutional plane is probably the one that we identify first and foremost. Do we get our news from radio or print? And what makes it as news differs institutionally across these different alternatives. For instance, back in the 1960s, California became known as the quirky state, largely because news was dependent on the ascent of broadcast television primetime as it was taking shape on the East Coast. And because film needed to move from the West Coast to the East Coast in time for primetime news, it meant that the time difference, we couldn't get visuals of California in time for that day's news. So instead we got timeless stories about California, lifestyle stories, stories that emphasized how different it was, but could be used and inserted into different primetime lineups on any given time or day. Conversely, mobile phones today offer multiple bottoms-up vantage points of events that we typically would not have the same degree of visualization. Terror attacks, for instance, certainly depended on mobile phones in our coverage of 9/11, our coverage of the London subway bombings, our coverage of the Mumbai terror attacks. But what this raises is the question of authorization and credibility, and certainly those same bottoms-up videos in a demonstration in Tehran 2 years ago when a political science student was shot to death, and an anonymous YouTube video made its way to all of the networks, the question of credibility certainly comes to the forefront. A second plane is the organizational plane. Do we get our television, do we get our mediation from Fox TV or MSNBC? And this works not only at the time in which we get coverage, but over time as well. And one of my favorite examples has to do with the JFK assassination and the way in which the reporting of Kennedy's death was wound up primarily in the professional lore and organizational lore associated with CBS News. Because Dan Rather, as a then up-and-coming reporter at the time, had been on the site and was able to report the news of Kennedy's death, this becomes the way in which we know of Kennedy's death for decades after. The professional plane is a tremendous source of mediation. Professionalism is supported by conventions that mediate reality, a call to objectivity, balance, sourcing conventions by which A said B counts as true, even if B is false, the separation of fact and opinion. We've all seen examples where these professional norms constitute problems. The coverage of the weapons for mass destruction is perhaps one of our most recent examples. And finally, the representational plane of mediation, which is where my own work lies most primarily. The question of images versus sounds versus words and what difference that makes in both content and form of the reality that is being distilled. We know that images tend to be schematic, dramatic, formulaic, simplistic, and repetitive to the extent that we often know what a news event is about without even seeing much about that event other than a cursory glimpse at a picture. So, for example, pictures of gaunt bodies with barbed wire immediately signify genocide. Pictures of crumpled landscapes immediately signify natural disaster. And there's a sliding scale of appropriateness that differs by context. The dead, for instance, tend to be more graphic when they are culturally and geographically distant. The dead of 9/11 tended to play quite obscurely in this country and were used with great degrees of graphicness elsewhere, versus the dead of the tsunami of 2004, which played quite graphically here and not at all in the regions afflicted by the disaster. All of this does not suggest that questions don't remain about mediation in journalism. What is a medium? Where does a medium begin and end remained uppermost in our discussions of them, and they've become much worse in an age of new media, the incessant recycling by which news travels across different platforms, and the shared news agendas that tend to connect news media, both old and new, so that we have fundamental questions about how to source a story, how to track its trajectory. How much autonomy does a medium have in shaping experience? Here is the tension between technological determinism and social constructivism, by which we don't know how much the technology determines, how much the people determine the technology. And finally, the distribution of power in society. The idea that each act of mediation pushes certain aspects of experience and drowns out others means that often what results is reflective of those with the most power. We tend to get news wherever we are, of elite nations, elite agendas, elite people, much more so than those of the disadvantaged or marginalized. My point has been that journalism acts as a platform for offering us a distilled view of experience that is mediated on multiple planes. But I think it's important to remember that many of them we don't recognize at the same time as we see them.